Hello everyone, Steffi here. This is a part 2 to a video I made a while ago, so for context, go watch that one first. I'm not going to delay, let's get into more of my problems with how people scale One Piece. Let's start with the Vivre cards. The Vivre cards are canon. They are written by the author of the series, and he even references them in SBS segments and interviews. So Oda clearly treats them as a source of canon information. Now, that doesn't mean they're perfect. Sometimes they omit some information to avoid spoilers, sometimes Oda changes them retrospectively due to him changing his mind, and sometimes they just make mistakes that Oda slowly amends. And yes, individual pieces of information can change, but it doesn't suddenly make the entire databook non-canon. Overall, the Vivre cards remain one of the best supplementary sources we have. SBS jokes are canon. Another thing people dismiss far too quickly is information from the SBS. I often hear people say, that was just a joke. The problem is that Oda doesn't separate jokes from canon. He regularly answers serious questions, hypothetical questions, and comedic questions in exactly the same place and manner. And he treats all of these answers as part of the world. Robin's giant breast secretly being onions is obviously ridiculous, but it's still canon. A better example for power scaling is Oda explaining the minimum requirements needed to defeat an L. It doesn't matter whether the question was funny or wasn't based on an on-screen event. If Oda gives an answer, it's usable evidence unless the story contradicts it, since it's still a secondary source. One Piece characters don't get weaker from aging. In SBS 82, Oda states that with One Piece, he is living out his fantasy that old people don't get any weaker with age, and this claim is extremely consistent in the actual story. One Piece characters don't seem to have a traditional prime, where they inevitably decline afterwards, as long as they continue living, training, or fighting. We have multiple examples of characters that don't get any weaker from aging, and every character in the series who has or is implied to have lost some strength with time has a separate excuse from aging for why they lost said strength. Don Chinzhou becomes weaker after losing his primary weapon, but after regaining it, we are told he can again perform as in his prime, and it's never even implied he is degraded with age. Dr. Koreha isn't even a fighter, and yet she retains her youthful strength well into her 140s. Scopper, even after he hung up his axes and spent years chilling with his wife, is never even implied to have lost his strength. Big Mom is not only not implied to have gotten any weaker, but it's even implied she got stronger into her 60s. Sengoku is never implied to have gotten any weaker. Rayleigh stopped fighting and spent decades depressed and trying to off himself, and yet, despite all that, his performance against Kizaru puts him around where he should scale. He does think to himself that if he was younger, he'd be able to not only fight Kizaru evenly, but he'd also be able to save the Straw Hats. Personally, I think he's just lamenting his powerlessness against an admiral, since if we interpret that literally, then pre-depression Rayleigh would scale noticeably above modern Kaido, Big Mom, Luffy, and even Scopper, which I don't think fits Oda's intentions nowadays. So, even Rayleigh, who has many reasons to degrade apart from age, is still around where he was years ago. Whitebeard not only still holds the title of the world's strongest man, but the narrator also confirms that while he's still on his medication, he is the world's strongest man as of chapter 234. And neither in the main story nor the Ace novel is it ever implied his strength has degraded due to anything other than his illness. And no, Akainu's statement means nothing, since he was literally wrong. Whitebeard's own doctor corrects him one page later. Garp is the perfect example of this. We literally get a montage of him going from the point he reached his prime in the Roger era to the modern day. And we see he doesn't lose any strength at all. He does say that techniques he hasn't used in a while aren't what he remembers them being. But both times he downplays himself are suspicious. The first time, he's pretending he's trying to catch Luffy in front of Kuzan, who just doesn't give a frick, and in the second, he's trying to convince his students that they should value their lives over his. Hyogoro did decline, but he's spent decades completely broken, starved, and tortured. That isn't the normal aging. Despite all that, he still retained his Haki mastery. And finally, there's Bani. She can make people weaker by aging them, but her devil fruit doesn't simply increase someone's age, it transforms them into one possible future version of themselves. So, them getting weaker isn't necessarily from just aging, but from aging into a feeble future. So, One Piece characters don't get weaker from aging, and the few people we see lose strength in their later years have different reasons for losing their strength. This is important for understanding the relation of power between the old gen and the current one. Another thing people often misunderstand is narrator statements. The One Piece narrator not only narrates, but Oda likes to use them to give introductions to some characters, and not every introduction works the same way. I think there are 4 different categories that are split using 2 conditions. And those conditions are objective word of God / subjective in-world knowledge and power related / non-power related. Let's go through them using some examples. The previously mentioned introduction of Whitebeard in chapter 234 is a direct statement of fact about his power. We can observe the same with Mihawk's introduction in chapter 50. These would therefore be power-related objective statements. On the other side, we have non-power related subjective statements, such as third-party nicknames of some of the cast. For example, Erusius and Law's nicknames. They are written in quotes to denote that they are in-universe said by someone. We don't know who calls them Mad Monk and Surgeon of Death, or why they are called that. They are just some vague in-universe nicknames that tell us very little and definitely nothing concrete about power. As for objective, non-power related examples, we can look at Ace, who is plainly stated to be the 2nd Division commander of the Whitebeard Pirate in chapter 157. However, this doesn't necessarily tell us anything about his strength, especially after we learn more about the structure of the Whitebeard Pirates later in the story, or the supernova introductions in chapter 498, which just plainly state where they are from. And lastly, we have subjective, power-related statements, such as Kaido's introduction. During his introduction in chapter 795, we get a recount of his life as a pirate, which is formatted as objective fact, so we can say that all his mentioned exploits happened. Then, at the end, we see a switch to non-objective, in-universe statements in quotes. Things like "people say" are clearly presented as in-universe beliefs rather than narrative confirmation. So, this isn't confirmation that he's the strongest creature or that he's unbeatable on sea, land or air. It's just telling us the lore that's built up around him. I'm going to make a small side note here. We see in supplementary materials, like with Skull from the Ace novel or the Sabaody Archipelago Marines from Fanleather, that in the world of One Piece it's a common hobby to just power scale famous marines and pirates. And so, these in-universe subjective statements seem to come from the general populace, who only have access to the newspapers and wanted posters, and who don't know about things like devil fruits or haki. So anyways, that's most of the stuff I wanted to get off my chest that I didn't think warranted their own videos. If people are interested, I can absolutely make separate videos going much deeper into each of these topics, because honestly every one of them has pretty significant implications for One Piece power scaling. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and maybe leave a nice comment. If you hated it, hit the dislike button and leave me a few creative death threats. The last time I said this, I got 0 dislikes and no death threats, so clearly I'm amazing and you should really consider subbing. Also check me out on Twitter for more content. Anyway, that's all for today, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.